Welcome back. We're recapping President Obama's final State of the Union speech and discussing the political wins and losses throughout his presidency. Let's get back to our panel. Saeed, when President Obama took office, he inherited two controversial programs from the Bush administration. One was torture, the other was Guantanamo Bay, which he promised to close shortly after he took office. He stopped torture. But at the same time, he also expanded another very controversial program, which was the use of drones.
Drone war.
The drone war. He may, in the future, become known as the drone president. What do you make of that?
Absolutely. And I think he talked about it yesterday. He talked about eliminating Osama bin Laden. He talked about eliminating al-Awlaki, destroying the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So that was all done by drones. He's expanded it beyond anybody's imagination. This is a man who came into office and immediately was given the Nobel Prize on the hope that all wars would end. And in fact, that was his promise. In fact, he promised that he would see to it, or would see, or under his tenure, he would see the emergence of a Palestinian state, an Arab-Israeli peace, something that he did not even mention last night or in his last speech in the UN General Assembly. So definitely in the areas of, let's say, the wars that are going on, whether they are overt or covert wars in so many places around the world against extremists and against terrorists and so on. But also he has a lot of successes to show. I think that Iran is a success for this president, and he was able to achieve something that his previous, the previous administration couldn't do. He achieved on Cuba a tremendous feat on Cuba. He's still working to close down Guantanamo, and I think he just might succeed before he leaves office by closing that down. So true, he ended torture, expanded drones, but he also has gone a long way towards at least ending that kind of American behavior.
All right, Jeff, Saeed just mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. When you look across at this presidency so far, what do you see as his biggest foreign policy achievement?
Well, I think Saeed noted two of the really big ones just now. I think the nuclear deal will go down in history as being a huge accomplishment for the president if it works. And certainly the White House is confident that it will, and the administration is confident that it will. The détente with Cuba is also another big accomplishment for this president, and that's something I think we're going to continue to see him working on this year, particularly if he ends up going to Cuba, but also just continuing to pull back the layers that have built up over decades of tension between Cuba and the United States, and it's clearly something he wants to continue to work on. Otherwise, the Guantanamo issue is a big one. There's no question about that, and he hinted again last night that that's something he will continue to work on. But then, in terms, you asked about what are his victories, some of the things that will hang over him. Clearly, we sort of talked about this before, the strategy against Islamic State and the ongoing unrest in the Middle East is something that he hasn't been able to clear up. I would take issue, however, with what Saeed said about coming in and promising to end all wars. I don't think the president ever did promise that. I think he promised to end, having troops in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And he did make a mention last night of saying the United States does not need to be and should not be the policeman for the world. But he certainly is committed to protecting Americans, and if that means sending troops somewhere, he's still going to do that.
Saeed, I'm going to give you a chance to quickly respond to that.
Well, I perhaps was a bit too ambitious on my part to say promising to end all wars, but definitely to end the Iraq war. Now we're back involved with Iraq, with 3,500 troops in Iraq. Afghanistan is in a pickle, in a very bad situation. In fact, in his last State of the Union last year, he talked about how we are there are no American combat units at war in Afghanistan. So yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was some sort of a fight going on where American lives were lost in Afghanistan. So I think that he came, with big sort of, agenda to end the war, to end America's involvement, to improve its image throughout the world. I know I was in Iraq during the time that Obama was elected to the presidency, and there was a great deal of hope that things will change. So on that score, he has not accomplished what he set out to.
Okay, Wang, let's go back to Asia. President Obama moved ahead with the so-called pivot to Asia. He was very critical of China's policy in the South China Sea. He went ahead with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of course, China is not part of that partnership. One of the big success stories for this presidency was he was able to work very closely with the Chinese leadership, with President Xi Jinping, especially on things like climate change. How will his presidency be seen by China?
Well, I think that he largely sustained the momentum of U.S.-China relationship in the past 7 years. On the military and strategic side, if you think about it, the Chinese military and the U.S. military did not cut ties once. Instead, they reinforced, they enhanced their cooperation on anti-piracy trainings, on Ebola, fighting Ebola, and cooperation in fighting pirates in the Gulf of Eden. And also on the economic side, of course, the two countries' trade will soon surpass $600 billion to be the largest anywhere in the world. And the 10-year multiple entry visa really, in a tangible way, benefited people on both sides. Some of my Chinese friends are telling me that it feels like a green card, a 10-year green card. So on a people-to-people level, but on the ideological level, you still hear China fear-mongering every once in a while, if not more frequent. I think that is largely due to the, like himself said, the post-World War II architecture in place that needs an update, but he has not done so yet.
Abby, getting back to a domestic issue, an African-American law professor at Georgetown University, Paul Butler, was writing in the New York Times, and he said this about race relations in the United States under President Obama. He said, neither Obama nor the United States has lived up to the promise and expectations of that first election night when people of all ethnicities danced together in the streets of Harlem. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. I think President Obama would acknowledge that that is probably, and as he said, he feels like, perhaps only Lincoln or Roosevelt could have done more to repair the ties among people in this country. But there are deep divisions. I mean, in the last 18 months, this conversation about policing and race in our major cities in New York and Chicago, Baltimore, these are all things that feel incredibly divisive to Americans. I think the president feels like he has failed in broaching a conversation between African Americans in this country and perhaps white working class Americans in this country who are moving away from his party pretty rapidly. We are at a place where perhaps now we're talking about race in more stark terms than ever before. And maybe what we're seeing here is things getting worse before they get better. You can make that argument. But I think that the president, he came in on hope and change. And I think many Americans don't feel like we have gotten to the change.
Jeff, very quickly, I've got 15 seconds. What can we expect in the months ahead?
I think you can definitely expect the president to push on things that he still cares about in terms of policy priorities like criminal justice reform, like climate change, like Guantanamo Bay. And I think that he will work on sort of making that optimistic approach that he tried to articulate last night a reality, and that you'll see him talking to Americans, doing trips, traveling, doing some campaigning as well for whoever becomes the Democratic nominee to ensure that his legacy continues and that his legacy is one that he's happy with.